It was a winter night, the kind where the cold seeps into the bones and the wind whispers dark secrets through the cracks in Alice's old house. Sitting in the living room, she tried to immerse herself in a book, wanting to fill the void left by the absence of her husband, who had left on a business trip. The house, normally cozy and familiar, had now turned into a dark and strange place. The wood creaked and creaked as the winter winds echoed through the hallways, and the fireplace crackled as the only source of heat and light. The darkness outside was oppressive. Alice felt alone, a loneliness that deepened with each passing minute. The house, full of memories and stories, now seemed filled with a cold emptiness. She knew she should get used to the temporary solitude while her husband was away, but something about the night made her mind uneasy. The minutes turned into hours, and the feeling that she wasn't alone began to creep into her mind. Every creak of wood, every sigh of wind, felt like a silent presence, lurking in the shadows. Alice looked out the window, and the darkness outside was impenetrable, as if the world had disappeared, leaving her completely isolated. As midnight approached, Alice decided it was time to go to bed and try to sleep. However, as she climbed the stairs that led to her room, she had a distinct impression that she was not alone. A chilling sensation ran down her spine, and she quickly turned to check the empty hallway, but nothing was there. Convincing herself that her mind was just playing tricks on her, Alice entered her room and closed the door. She was determined to ignore the nagging feeling that haunted her. However, as he lay down on the bed and closed his eyes, the strange sounds continued. Distant creaks, imaginary footsteps. Everything seemed to whisper that she wasn't alone in the house. Alice's breathing quickened, and she gripped the sheets tightly. That night was turning into a nightmare, and the silence only terrified her even more. An hour passed, then another, but sleep didn't come. Every sound, every shadow, seemed to conspire to keep her awake. Alice looked at the clock beside her bed, whose luminous numbers seemed to dance as time slowly dragged by. Finally, she heard something that made her jump up in bed. It sounded like the slow, heavy shuffle of footsteps in the hallway, like someone approaching his room. Alice held her breath, hearing the footsteps approaching the room, like a hammer hitting her heart. With shaking hands, she turned on the bedside lamp, and the dim light illuminated the room. She glanced quickly at the door, expecting to find her husband there, but the room was empty. The deserted hallway revealed only the darkness of the house, as if nothing had happened. Alice was alone in the darkness, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to convince herself that her imagination was playing with her, but something in the back of her mind warned her that the night was far from over. The minutes dragged on, the bed became increasingly uncomfortable, and the feeling that something was lurking in the shadows only intensified. Alice's mind began to play with her, creating figures in the shadows and whispering horrors that left her with goosebumps. This is how the first part of the lonely night unfolded, with Alice increasingly tormented by the feeling that the house hid secrets she could barely understand. The darkness was a constant reminder of her loneliness, and she could barely imagine what the night still had in store for her. Alice was huddled under the blankets, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as she tried to ignore the growing terror that was gripping her. The house was eerily silent, as if it was waiting for something, a dark revelation about to emerge from the shadows. As time passed, Alice's anxiety grew. She knew she couldn't stay hidden under the covers forever. Finally, with a resigned sigh, she decided it was time to face the darkness of the house. Alice got up from the bed, her bare feet touching the cold floor. She grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table and pressed the switch. The dim light illuminated the room, but it wasn't enough to dispel the shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. With renewed courage, she left the room and began searching the house. Each step echoed through the empty hallways, as if the house itself was watching her. The feeling that something sinister was lurking in the shadows wouldn't leave her. Alice went to the living room, where she had spent the first part of the evening. The fireplace was still crackling, casting distorted shadows throughout the room. She looked around, hoping to find some explanation for the strange sounds that had tormented her. But the room was empty, and the silence was deafening. She felt like something was hiding, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. With flashlight in hand, she continued her search, determined to discover the source of the unsettling sounds. As she investigated the rooms and hallways, the noises seemed to move, as if they were playing with her, evading her search. Fear was growing, and Alice was beginning to question her own sanity. Were these sounds real or just a figment of his tormented imagination? As she advanced through the house, Alice heard a sound that made her heart freeze. It was a laugh that didn't sound human. The sound echoed off the walls, seeming to come from everywhere at once. It was as if the house itself was laughing at her, mocking her attempt to unravel the mystery. Alice trembled, and her grip on the lantern tightened. The house seemed to come to life, as if it were trying to communicate with her in some way. But this communication was unsettling and disturbing, as if the walls had eyes and mouths and were whispering dark secrets. Every corner she turned, every door she opened, only seemed to increase her sense of despair. It was as if the house was reveling in her terror, taking her deeper and deeper into the unfolding nightmare. When she finally reached the kitchen, Alice felt something was wrong. The cupboards were all open, as if someone had rummaged through the contents. The sound of the chilling laughter still echoed in her mind, and she realized that the house hid secrets that were about to be revealed. The truth was more terrifying than Alice could have imagined. The old house, which she thought she knew so well, now seemed strange, full of sinister mysteries. She knew she needed to continue the investigation, even if it meant facing the unknown. As Alice explored every dark corner of the house, the night advanced inexorably. The darkness outside the window was so thick that it seemed to swallow everything around it. And as the clock ticked down, she began to realize that the house was not just a place of shelter and safety, but also a receptacle of secrets and horrors that were about to emerge from the shadows. Alice continued her tireless search through the house, determined to discover the source of the mysterious noises and sinister laughter that had tormented her during the night. Every step she took seemed to echo in a silent chorus of shadows, as if the house were alive and watching her. She reached the attic, a place she rarely visited. The attic was a maze of dusty boxes, full of forgotten souvenirs and old objects. As the flashlight illuminated the place, Alice felt an even stronger sensation that something was wrong. A rustle of fabric caught his attention. She saw an old wedding dress hanging from a wooden beam, swaying gently, as if carried by a non-existent breeze. Alice frowned, as there were no open windows there. As she looked at the dress, the flashlight wavered, and for a brief moment, darkness fell over the attic. When the light came back on, the wedding dress was no longer there. Instead, there was just a dark, wet stain on the dusty floor. Alice felt a chill run down her spine. Whatever was happening in that house, it was getting more and more terrifying. She knew she could no longer deny the reality of the events she had witnessed. As she walked away from the attic, a shuffling sound made her stop. It was as if something heavy was being moved downstairs. Alice hesitated for a moment, but her curiosity and determination impelled her to go downstairs and investigate. When she reached the ground floor, the sound of dragging became louder and more distinct. She followed the sound to the living room, where her flashlight illuminated a terrifying scene. The furniture had been moved, and in the center of the room, an old portrait hanging on the wall was now upside down. Alice knew something wasn't right. The house was revealing itself to be a place filled with secrets and horrors that she could not understand. She felt a deep fear and a sensation of being watched by invisible eyes. The sinister laughter that had haunted her during the night echoed once again, this time closer. Alice turned quickly, shining her flashlight into the room, but no one was visible. The feeling that something was approaching her made her shiver. The voice she heard that night, although faint and distant, was unmistakable. It was her husband's voice, a voice she would recognize anywhere. A wave of relief washed over her. Maybe he had come back sooner, and it was all just a bad joke. Alice ran toward the voice, her flashlight lighting the way. She entered the dining room and stopped abruptly. Her husband was there, but he didn't look the same. His eyes were empty, and he was completely still. "Honey, you're finally back," he said in a monotone, no expression on his face. Alice tried to speak, but her words betrayed her, unable to express the panic that gripped her. She could see in her husband's eyes that something terrible had happened. As she watched in horror, her husband began to laugh, but it wasn't a normal laugh. It was a sinister laugh, the same one that had haunted her during the night. His eyes glittered with a malevolence she didn't recognize. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, as he slowly approached Alice. "This is our home now, and you have no place here." Terror gripped Alice when she realized she was not facing her husband. Something had taken possession of him, something dark and terrible that prevented her from recognizing him. She ran to the door, but it was locked. The house seemed to have a life of its own, a will of its own that prevented her from escaping. As her husband advanced towards her, his sinister laugh echoing, Alice realized she was alone in the darkness with something not of this world. Alice was cornered in the dining room, her breathing labored and her eyes fixed on the possessed husband who was approaching her. The room was permeated with an oppressive atmosphere, as if the house itself was closing in on her. "Who are you?" Alice finally managed to stammer out as the flashlight shook in her shaking hands. The possessed husband let out another sinister laugh, a laugh that seemed to come from a completely different dimension. "You will never know, my dear. I inhabit this house now, and soon you will do the same." Alice's fear turned to determination. She would not allow this evil entity to dominate her. With one last look at the husband she loved, now unrecognizable, Alice turned and ran towards the staircase, determined to find a way to escape. As he climbed the stairs, the house seemed to resist his efforts to escape. The ground beneath her feet creaked and seemed to move, as if trying to stop her from moving forward. Alice could hear her possessed husband's laughter echoing behind her, getting closer and closer. Finally, she reached the upstairs hallway and ran towards the bedroom door. With one last effort, she managed to open the door and locked herself inside. Alice's breathing was uneven, and her heart was pounding, but at least she was temporarily safe from the entity that haunted the house. She approached the bedroom window and looked out. The darkness of night still enveloped the house, but Alice knew she needed to find help. Her phone was on the nightstand, and she quickly dialed the police, telling them what was happening. While waiting, Alice began to search the room in search of any clues that could explain what was happening. She found an old diary of her husband's, which detailed his growing obsession with home and attempts to communicate with the afterlife. As she read the yellowing pages, a dark story emerged. There were mentions of dark rituals performed in the house in hopes of reaching the spirits. Her husband was willing to do anything to get answers, and that had unleashed forces he couldn't escape. As Alice leafed through the diary, her possessed husband's voice echoed down the hall, calling her name. The entity was determined to bring her back to the darkness of the house. The police finally arrived, and Alice ran to the bedroom door to meet them. She explained the situation and desperately asked for help. The police entered the house, and Alice guided them to the room where she had taken refuge. However, when they entered the room, there was no sign of her possessed husband. The window was open, and the darkness of the night enveloped them. Officers began investigating the home, but found nothing but unsettling silence. They questioned Alice about what had happened, but the young girl was so traumatized that she could barely get the words out. The entity that had possessed her husband seemed to have disappeared, at least temporarily. As the police continued to search the house, Alice looked out the open window, observing the darkness of the night. She knew the entity was still nearby, waiting for the right moment to return. The battle in the shadows was far from over. Months later, Alice sold the house, unable to bear the memory of the terrifying events that had occurred. She moved away, hoping to leave the nightmare behind. However, the entity haunting the house was not willing to give up so easily. She continued to haunt Alice, like a shadow in the darkness, reminding her that evil could be anywhere. Alice tried to seek help from experts in paranormal activity, but the entity continued to torment her, a sinister presence that had no intention of leaving. The battle in the shadows persisted, and Alice knew she would have to fight to protect her sanity and her life. She learned that evil can hide in the walls of seemingly ordinary places, waiting to emerge and unleash unspeakable horrors. However, Alice was determined not to give in to the terror. She would continue to fight the dark entity that haunted her, hoping to find a way to cast it out once and for all. The battle in the shadows was far from over, and Alice was willing to face the evil that lurked in the darkness, no matter the cost.